Hi, I'm Dr. Rasheem. I am an independent researcher and scholar, a social science scholar to be more specific. A lot of my scholarships tends to focus primarily on giving a critical examination to culture through the lens of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, other things that are very much connected to identity. As an instructor, I'm very much committed to helping students gain a really deep insight into interdisciplinary, cross-cultural, and intersectional approach to the academy, and more specifically to the academic study of marginalized people. Today, I will be talking to you about African American motherhood, contextualized. So one of the reasons that I feel like it's particularly important to talk about African American motherhood and put it into context is because although the image of motherhood has always differed across race, much of what is understood about motherhood today is based on the norms of white middle class women. Right? So you have this whole concept of what it is and what it means to be a woman conceptualized and created by a specific set of people. Of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with being able to talk about an experience or a human institution from your own unique standpoint. That's very much needed, very essential. The challenge comes into play when that then deeply specific experiences, then universalized, and then used as the measure by which all other mothers or all other folks in that particular relationship dynamic is then measured, right? So you have these, the nature and the experiences of motherhood largely written from a Eurocentric perspective. African American mothers are then examined by that set of criteria. So if you have this one set of criteria and rules and what is normalized as this is what it means and this is what it is to be a mother, and you exclude a large population of that, not taken into context, race or culture or religion, then you lose a really big portion of the institution that is motherhood by not considering or contextualizing those things. And also what happens is anything that is not in line with that thing is then considered deviant. This shows up quite a bit in the field of social work. So one of the ways it shows up in social work is much of the literature that's written around and about Black motherhood is from a deficit standpoint. It's by this particular measurement and anything that deviates from that, right? So the focus is strongly on, particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, still some in the early 2000s, where the focus is on the mother being single, whether or not she's on welfare, whether or not she's a teenage mother. So you have these markers that kind of decide where the focus or where the attention particularly goes, right? So a person might ask the question, how is motherhood different for Black women, or what cultural context could possibly be different? They're both mothers. They do some of the same things, have some of the same rules or what have you, some of the same customs, but that's actually not true. We're very much influenced by our culture, our background, our religion, our communities, and then there's also historical factors that play into how we view and understand what motherhood is, how it's practiced, how it's able to be practiced. There's class considerations to make. All of these things are part of the context that makes up the bigger picture, and to miss pieces of that, to miss a whole segment of a population to be able to inform that, particularly when they will then later be measured by those criteria, is to miss a big part. So on the piece where we discuss what's different and what's similar, let's really just talk about what the standard or criteria is for how we've decided as U.S. in the U.S. culture, how we measure motherhood. So frequently in my work, particularly when I'm talking about women or motherhood, I reference the cult of womanhood. And the cult of womanhood is something that kind of lays out what, as a U.S. culture, we've decided it means to be a true woman, right? And there's a large section of that focuses on motherhood, aspects of motherhood. So what it means for your child to, for example, be legitimized. And that still proceeds today. We still use words like legitimate and illegitimate when we're referring to the children of folks. So some of the things that are connected to the cult of true womanhood are reliance on a male breadwinner. So the study of Black women, and if you're seeing, and one of the things that come out of a lot of studies are whether or not they're head of household, right? So that's a deviation from the cult of true womanhood. Another example would be marriage to a heterosexual male. So if you are queer identified, that is a deviation from the cult of true motherhood. If you have decided not to get married, that is a deviation from the cult of true womanhood. So again, you have these things popping up in the social work literature of this focus on the woman being single. And then if the woman is relying on or receiving welfare, she's not relying on a male breadwinner. So those are some of the things that how anything that deviates from that particular cult of true womanhood comes up in the literature, and it's looked at not as different, but from a deficit standpoint. African American motherhood has long been viewed as a site of racial progress or racial degradation, right? So it's kind of one of those things where you are either superwoman, amazing, and you are uplifting community, or you are tearing it down and destroying it. That's a lot to put on one person's shoulders, right? Very well-meaning feminist literature has given considerable attention to motherhood without a thorough understanding of the impact of racism on motherhood or how class impacts motherhood. Without taking those things into consideration, again, you're just not putting into context that experience or some of the choices that mother then is given or is able to make in that particular environment, given those circumstances. What tends to happen, unfortunately, is Black mothers are measured by their outputs, right? Their outputs like how many children they have, or their child's outputs like test scores, or their contribution to the social economic structure. Early writings on African American families emphasize this reassertion of male headship, right? So you see this, again, reassertion of the cult of true womanhood, and the way to fix or mend this pathologized Black family is through making the male head, right? This plays out, of course, with Moynihan's 1965 report. Hill in 1999 identified the rise of 13 problems, 3 of which have to do with the dissolution of marriage, separation, and out of wedlock births, right? So you have this again. Both of these are also men, and they're discussing Black families. And in some ways, largely, particularly with Moynihan, very much pathologizing the Black family, listing all of these things that are wrong. Hill then again comes up in 1999 and identifies the rise of these 13 problems, 3 of which are very much connected to the cult of true womanhood, right? So there's the dissolution of marriage, there's separation, there's out of wedlock births. Hence why then, of course, you see all of this literature in the social work literature, specifically focusing on what? Single mothers, teenage pregnancy, whether or not male has headship. And any, again, deviation from that makes her then a deviant mother, a bad mother. She's measured by these particular criteria, not taking into consideration all of these other contexts around the choices that were made and why these choices were made. And also not even take into consideration her own input into what it is to be a good mother. A lot of that is also then internalized. Some things to also consider when you're contextualizing African American motherhood very much is religion. There are ways in which even with those tenets, they're largely internalized. So that person, that particular mother may identify and say for herself, well, it means that I'm married, and if I'm not married while I'm a mother, then I'm a bad mother. That's still within that broader context of how that person is then impacted by their environment, by their culture, by society largely. One of the things that I do appreciate about Hill's take on this is that he does identify how racism, sexism, and migration impact this new structure of the Black family, or this particular structure of the Black family as they were in that particular time. He does acknowledge, at the very least, those aspects and influences, along with some others. Again, there were 13 issues, and there were just 3 of them that had to do primarily with the cult of true womanhood. There were other ones that are connected to unemployment, poverty, spousal abuse, child abuse, alcoholism, poor health. He identifies those as 3 problems. And I think to further contextualize that, it would be great to have that exploration and to also look at the larger structure and see what then contributes to those problems. So one might ask, of course, the question, what does family structure actually look like within some African American communities? And there's a large connection to extended family, or what some may refer to as fictive kin. So these are just members of a social network who may provide familial support to one another, and they're not necessarily biologically related, not necessarily married into the family. But several scholars have taken up the articulation and redefining African American families behind this nucleus. That's another aspect of the cult of true womanhood, is that family is this closed nucleus that is man, woman, child, or children. And that is what constitutes family. That is not what scholars have found in their research is actually what is played out. So that's very important to take note of. And here's why. Because I think sometimes that one of the connections that is made is if, for example, if the father and the mother of that child, if it is another father and not another woman that is a child, if they are not married, then the inference that is drawn for that is that the father is absent, right, in the child's life. So if the father does not reside in the home, then they're absent. Or if the father is in fact absent from the child's life, that the mother is just doing it all herself, right? But what studies have found is there are full networks. There are aunties and play cousins and friends and neighbors, and just very much communal, that is a large network of folks who then help and support this collective kinship child rearing. So a study conducted by Bloom examined how working class African American women talked about marriage and motherhood. They found that mothers draw from ideas of community-based independence to resist assumptions derived from the cult of true womanhood about non-marital relationships. So with their male partner and shared care for children. So they still have this co-parenting like relationship, or this co-parenting type of relationship. However, it's not this strict reliance on a male breadwinner. Hill also notes that it's often non-blood related members of the community that provide support for children and families. Now, several studies have highlighted ways in which African American motherhood are different from the cult of true womanhood. Some might even argue motherhood today for anybody is different from the cult of true womanhood in some respects, right? The ones that are easy to identify for African American mothers are concepts of marriage, concepts of what headship means, ideas around work, and even more specifically, gender roles. Those are 4 very specific ways that motherhood is looked at differently for African American women. So we could even start with, according to findings in a survey of public opinion conducted by the Pew Research Center, it found that 64% of about 1,000, little over 1,000 American surveys indicated that single motherhood was a big problem, right? So as recently as 2013, we still have this idea and concept that if this woman who has a child is not legitimized through marriage, it's a big problem. The thing around that is, it's not saying a child should have 2 caring, loving people that are taking care of that child. It does not say anything around just co-parentship. It specifically says single, which is a marital status, and that is a really big problem. Now, on the other hand, the study also reported that whites, more than non-whites, I think it was something like 67% versus 56%, viewed single motherhood as a big problem. As a point of example, one participant in the Bloom study, Jenny, had children with her stable partner of 15 years, and they decided not to get married. She would show up in that study, right? If they wanted to just document and get numbers of how many African American mothers or how many African American women who have children are not then married, and then the inference that is then drawn from that bit of information. It's something that deserves further investigation of why are we still using these antiquated ways of viewing motherhood, and additionally, why are we using measurements by which those mothers themselves have not identified as this is what it means to be a good mother or a true mother. Also, why are we looking at motherhood acontextually is another question that should be investigated. Now, this isn't to suggest in any way that all African American mothers reject the cult of true womanhood concepts. Not at all. Or reject being married, or reject headship, male headship, or reject work in a particular way, or gender roles. In fact, I would argue that the older the woman, the black woman, the black mother is, and the more religious she is, the more likely she is to accept those in a more traditional concept, right? In a more traditional, also real life, realized practice, right? So one thing that I think is important to get is not to say that this is the standard or the rule for any one people. What it really says is, what this whole thing is about is really contextualizing when we're investigating a particular person's experience, right? And to take all these things into consideration and note the influence of U.S. culture on African American culture, and note that African American culture is a part of U.S. culture. So when we are constructing tools and examining populations in different families, it would, be beneficial, to say the least, to us if we would include large portions of those folks, and then that we would then use that tool to measure their success by. So somewhat connected to those other studies, African American participants in a study conducted in 2016 by Barnes. In that study, the women she spoke to privileged marital stability over work stability, believing that marriage is necessary for communal success, right? However, many of other qualitative studies about motherhood over the past 2 decades did not find motherhood to have a significant impact on participants' experiences in marriage. Namely, Dow's study in 2014, another one that Dow did in 2016, Jenkins' study in 2005. In a study of perceived happiness outside of marriage among Black and white married spouses, Rank and Davis in 1996 found that Black wives ranked lower than their Black and white counterparts in marital satisfaction, and higher than both counterparts with their satisfaction of being a parent. So let's backtrack that a little bit and just kind of unpack what that study uncovered, right? Perceived happiness outside of marriage. They studied Black and white spouses. What they found is that Black wives ranked lower in satisfaction, but ranked higher in being parents. I think that deserves exploration, further investigation, and for another study to be done in more contemporary times, just to see how that may or may not have changed. One of the things that is probably important to note is that Those findings are pretty consistent with the 2009 U.S. Bureau of Census data that reported that the percentage of Black women who never marry are higher than non-Hispanic and white women at all age groups. While the participants in Bloom's study valued long-term partnerships and the presence of fathers in their child's lives, they challenged this idea of a reliance on a male breadwinner as tied to good mothering, right? So even if a mother decides that she's not getting married, I think it's important that we understand that that is not necessarily a rejection of a male partner. In fact, in many cases, they're still, in several cases, they're still with their male partners. And even when they're not, there's a lot of cases also where those men are still then active. I think because what it does is it doesn't just paint an interesting or obscure, acontextualized picture of Black women and Black families. It also paints a particular picture of Black men and their involvement in their child's lives. And it almost says that if they're not married to the woman, then they're not involved. And I know that to not be true in many cases. So we delved a bit into this aspect of marriage, right? And how it is just very important to just contextualize where to go with that. Somewhat related, but not always, is headship and this concept of headship. And what does it mean to be head of the family? Is it who makes the most money? Who wears the pants? Is it the man? Is it the woman? This whole concept around headship. And it's really interesting because although it's been well over 50 years since the Moynihan report claimed that the problem with African-American families were female-headed households and out-of-wedlock births, social workers and social work research is still largely concerned with the number of Black women who are married or not married, and who do we have in those scenarios who are head of household. So you have that on one end. You also have, again, and I want to really bring this home, that conversely, you have one participant in Burns' 2016 study that shared that she put a lot of energy into accepting male headship. It was something that she embraced and wanted. And I think that that's the case for a lot of women. So I keep bringing that up because I think it's important for us to just know and to kind of highlight that it's really about putting into context African-American motherhood experiences and not using tools to measure them that they weren't involved in creating. So you'll have studies that will say varying things. So the things that I appreciate about all of these studies is, for example, whether it's Dow's study or Barnes' study or Bloom's study, is because they actually asked these women the questions directly, right? They didn't simply collect data and say, this is the stat and here's my inference from this stat, as so many studies tend to do. They directly ask them the question. So in that, by that same token, you have Bloom's study, a qualitative study that he did of 20 Black mothers, revealed that participants in their study valued autonomy and independence over reliance on a male breadwinner. But they asked the question, and they asked the question directly of the people in which they were investigating, exploring, and researching to get what was the condition in that scenario, what was their preference. And they also put context within that. So we discussed marriage, and we talked a bit about headship, and now this concept of work. In the code of true womanhood, women don't work. They stay home and they take care of the babies, and the man goes to work. Even more specifically, in earlier times, the men would go to work, they would stay home, and their mammy or nanny or someone else would take care of the children. In any event, they stayed home and the man went to work. So in the true womanhood idealized construction of motherhood in America, it puts work as being oppositional and incompatible with good motherhood. Because how can you possibly be a good mother if you're pursuing a career? You don't have time for that. Much of what African American mothers understand or know about what it is to be a good mother largely, in large part, comes from their mother, even if it's something that they decide that they're not going to do because of the way that their mother did it. I found that in quite a bit of my own research, and one of the questions that I asked, how do you mother similarly to your mother, and how do you mother differently? I also asked the question around what is something that you know now as a mother that you appreciate about your mother that you did not necessarily appreciate then. So all of those types of questions help us to identify and really contextualize and provide a tool for how to examine and learn from and respect Black women and Black mothers as knowers. For example, one of the Black mothers in Dow's study in 2016 studied 24 African American mothers, and largely, I think it was about 16 of them, of the 24, connected with this notion of the significance of being a good mother, not as emphasized being a good wife. There's a lot of historical context and a lot of ways that we can go with that. Now, the thing that they did not say that they were told to be a bad wife, right? They were just emphasized on, one of the aspects was emphasized was being a good mother. It's very important to be a good mother. In my own research, mothers define motherhood as a divine appointment, was one of the highest quoted things. This is a divine appointment. This is a gift. And I think it says something about the importance and the significance that those mothers in those studies and the mothers in Dow's study gave to their work, to the institution of motherhood, to the relationship of motherhood, and particularly when they were raising African American girls. I find it interesting that despite the expansion of our understanding of gender roles and more women entering the workforce, that in a recent study, only 16% of Americans say that it is preferable for a mother to work full-time, while 1/3 noted it is ideal for the child if the mother does not work at all. That was in 2013. I think the part that I find particularly interesting about that is it doesn't seem to consider for a moment that it is possible that the father could stay home. It just doesn't seem to investigate that. And I think that is something to investigate, even if we're saying it is best for children to be at home and they should be there with one of their parents that loves and cares for them, because it's a very formative time of their life, you know? I think it's interesting that we say it's really not good. It's really not good if mother works full time. In 2016, we say that, right? I think that's particularly interesting. To further contextualize that, in Dow's study, that study was done in 2015. One of the participants stated that they don't think that it's acceptable for Black women who are professionals to stay at home. That contrast definitely exists outside of those two studies, right? So on one hand, you have this advocating for women to stay at home, And I think a lot of times when we say women, we're particularly talking about white women, unless we specifically say. So no, women should not stay at home. The concept is that women should stay at home. They should not work full time. And then in contrast, in Dow's study, a black woman, says that if she's a professional woman, it's not acceptable for her to be home. This is re-articulated. That's one question and one person responded to it, but this is actually articulated in like welfare law, right? In a lot of the laws that, for example, the Clinton administration brought through with their welfare reform and this emphasis on work.
Good afternoon. When I ran for president 4 years ago, I pledged to end welfare as we know it. I have worked very hard for 4 years to do just that. Today, the Congress will vote on legislation that gives us a chance to live up to that promise, to transform a broken system that traps too many people in a cycle of dependence to one that emphasizes work and independence.
So in that, when we're looking at social work and we're looking at social work practices and we're looking at welfare, if on one hand we say women should stay at home, but we're not willing to pay them to stay at home, particularly in one society where we're saying we do think that it's best for this woman to stay at home, and in this particular other incidents, if this woman, once that womanhood or that motherhood is racialized, then it's unprofessional. It's not becoming. It's unacceptable. In 2000, Collins points out that working has actually been an important dimension in Black motherhood. It is a motivator for Black mothers in a lot of cases. Motherhood is a motivator for higher work performance. So there's all these conversations, right, around work. Stay at home, don't stay at home if you're Black and professional. It's a strong aspect of the dimension of motherhood to stay at home. All of this is still being presented to contextualize it and to ask directly the folks those questions and look at it as difference and not deficit based, which the literature continues to do. It continues to pick a side, create laws on that side, create programming and monitoring and evaluation, and decide who gets what and how much of it they get based on strict adherence to these rules. So the other aspect that should be explored is the strict adherence to gender roles, right? So there's quite a bit of variance in the literature, just as with the other topics, around the impact of dual roles. In studies that I've conducted, I asked mothers about motherhood, and one of the things that they identified is nurturer provider. Their words, nurturer provider. In the cult of true womanhood, the woman is the nurturer, the man is the provider. So there's this deviation from that, and so it plays out in how they are critiqued, viewed, and evaluated. But if you ask a Black mother and she says that she views the most important aspect of her role is nurturer provider, then it would seem that you would measure her by her own valuation and learn from it. In Jackson's study, granted this was in 1993, it studied 111 employed single Black mothers. They found that mothers who preferred work experience had significantly less role restraint. The author also emphasized that education accounted for a significant amount of discrepancy and strain. Put another way, mothers who had exposure to education and training beyond high school experienced less strain when they preferred to stay at home. In another study conducted in 2000, that study added that African American mothers might experience greater satisfaction and less role strain than white women from the dual nurturer provider role. On the other hand, in a sample of 163 Black mothers, marital status, low income, maternal perceptions of adequacy, income for meeting family needs were significantly related to high maternal depressive symptoms. England found that there's actually a penalty for working mothers. That is, the time that mothers take off to take care of their children leads to diminished future earnings. For Black women, this penalty is smaller for third and subsequent children. If you get nothing else from this conversation, from this talk, the significance of African American motherhood being contextualized, the thing that makes it significant is that African American mothers have regularly been evaluated, judged, researched, their knowledge subjugated by measures that they did not have part in creating, by a concept and structure of motherhood that they may or may not agree with, but it was something, it was like a blanket understanding of this is what it should be. And at that point, they either choose to accept or reject it. And in the cases that they reject it, historically, they've been penalized for it. And that shouldn't be the case. And that's why African American motherhood should be contextualized.